Hey, it's Dave again, and I want to talk a little bit about civics today as we go into our cruciform class. There's a variety of subjects we're going to be talking about. And so I'm presenting some of this information in a live setting, but obviously not everybody can be here every time. So this is my attempt at kind of diving into more of it together. And so we're going to be spending some time today talking about civics. And so I'll be connecting that to the greater biblical narrative. But to study civics is to study ethics. And so to understand the complexity of interpretation is to appreciate ethics in action. So ethics is, it's connected to a number of philosophies and also to, in our case as Christians, the Bible. And so historically, classic ethics is connected to Greek philosophy and also Greek logic. So it's really where we get this idea of syllogisms from. So a syllogism is this idea that one thing follows another. A classic syllogistic structure, A equals B, B equals C, therefore A must equal C, is kind of a bit of a formula, but that's a syllogism. And so Greeks used syllogisms all over the place, and they used it as a way of creating deductive reasoning to arrive at a conclusion based on two or more propositions that were asserted or assumed to be true. So it was a form that was, I would say, perfected at some level by Aristotle, using what you'd start with would be a general statement, and then you would lead toward a specific statement from which a conclusion was deducted. Again, if A equals B, and if B equals C, therefore A must equal C. So as we dive in, there are some ethical theories. Those include the cognitive realist, the cognitivist error theory, and the non-cognitivist anti-realist. And from really the cognitive realist, we get the majority of our ethics today. And so if you were to imagine from that, we get deontological ethics and authoritative command ethics. We also get teleological ethics or consequentialist ethics. And we also get what are known as the classic virtue ethics. And so if you were to break those down, and I'll have a slide here at some point, under deontological or authoritative command, you have a number of, I would say, sub-ethics. You have divine command theory, you have the categorical imperative, you have intuitive command, you have social convention, and then you have social contract. All of these have different authors and thinkers. Hobbes obviously would be classic social contract. Categorical imperative, that'd be Immanuel Kant. So there are some key people we'll go through in the course of this conversation in our cruciform class. Under social ethics, you have what I would call as classical utilitarianism, and then you also have welfare utilitarianism. Under personal ethics, you'd have egoism, you'd have eudaimonianism, and you'd have evolutionary ethics. All right, so let's kind of begin to go through these and define these together. So there's deontological, teleological, and virtue ethics. Teleological is the theory of morality that derives a duty or a moral obligation from what is good or desirable as an end to be achieved. So in teleological, the ends justifies the means. So it's more about the amount of good in the end that you can create. So again, teleological, the ends justifies the means. Deontological will be the means justifying the ends, okay? So in deontological ethics, moral philosophy or deontology is a normal theory that a moral action should be based on whether an action itself is a right or wrong action under a series of rules, rather than based on the consequences of the action. So again, the means justifies the ends doesn't necessarily justify the means. So again, in simplicity's sake, teleological, the ends justifies the means, and deontological, the means justifies the ends. So a couple examples of deontological would be like Kant's universal categorical imperative. Virtue ethics would also fall under deontological, and this would include Aristotle's virtue ethics. So ethics really, in a lot of ways, splits into those two camps. You have deontological on the one hand and teleological on the other. So teleological is concerned with consequences on being good, on character and relationships. Deontological is really based on doing the right action, and it sort of approaches it by thinking about what you are supposed to do and your duty and your rights as a human being. So those are the separations in terms of ethics, and we'll be talking about that as it relates to civics. And so as you develop a biblical worldview, you begin thinking about ethics, and you begin to pull in the philosophy of Jesus and the philosophy of Paul and the philosophy of the Old Testament. And really, you have a pretty broad way of interpreting, and this is why we have churches that tend to have more theologically left-leaning things, which is more, the looking for what is good in the end as a whole, versus more of the right, which tends to be focused on, what's your duty as a Christian and the fact that you have personal responsibility. Those right-leaning churches tend to be more at home with a teleological ethic versus the deontological, which is, those are the rights that these are the right actions we should take, and they will ultimately benefit more people in the end. So that's probably a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's important for us just to begin talking about together. All right, so I want to begin breaking some of these down a little further. So the divine command theory. So this is Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, who turns out both are church fathers as well. Aquinas more from the Catholic perspective, and Augustine really seen in many ways as an early church father, but has heavily influenced the Protestant and the Protestant Reformation. So both of these men would see God as the origin and the regulator of morality, the moral imperative coming from God's self, being right or wrong based on his will or his command. And therefore, moral goodness is achieved by complying with his command. So this basically means if God says it, you should do something with that, okay? So you should do it. And so this is a meta-ethical theory because it's concerned with why things are right and wrong. Okay, so that's divine command theory. And so Plato was writing about a dialogue in which Socrates challenged this idea that morality is coming from God. And there were really two horns of the dilemma. So a horn is like that of a bull, or one side could impale you, or the other side could sort of impale you. And it's this dilemma of which do you choose? So the question is something good because God commands it? If that's so, this means that God has commanded you if he has commanded you to do something, it would be morally good to do so. So this makes, in Plato's thought, morality a little more arbitrary. It's no longer means what we thought it meant to be about good and decent and right and proper, but rather if God tells you to do something, it becomes right simply because he has said so. And that leads to the second point, which is if God's commanding something, he's doing so because it's good. This means that there's an independent standard of good, so that we don't need God at all. If there is a God, he is all-powerful. He cannot control what is right or wrong. He is actually bound by a higher standard of goodness, therefore supplanting God if God is in fact appealing to that goodness. So it can sometimes seem to make the theory feel morally arbitrary and even cruel to those who don't necessarily believe in God. And so here's some thinkers that sort of thought along these lines and why they sort of leaned into this idea of divine command theory. So Descartes said it's impossible to imagine anything is thought of in the divine intellect as good or true prior to the decision of the divine will to make it so. So he's in agreement with divine command theory. John Calvin, who's a church father in later centuries, and the author of Calvinism or Tulip, or this idea of the election of God's people. So he said God's command provide instructions for inward spiritual righteousness and outward decency. So he's again agreeing with divine command theory. And then William of Ockham said God cannot be obligated to act. With him, a thing becomes right solely because he wants it so. So this is, again, divine command theory. So one final thought on this, that Augustine really, I think, hammers this home by saying, I believe, therefore I understand. What he's saying there is, because I believe that God has said something, therefore I learn to understand it. And so this is a theory of ethics, and it's an important one, and it's one that is applicable today because billions and billions of people believe in the divine, whether they're Muslim or they're Jewish or they're a follower of Jesus and they're a disciple of Jesus and Christian like we are. Most of those folks are going to fall into this camp. And that is the dilemma. That is the dilemma I'm presenting to you of divine command theory. Is something good because God commands it? If God commands something, does it simply make it good? And that is a theory of ethics. Again, we're concerned with not just what it means for us, but how we utilize the theory in terms of ethics and civics in greater culture today. The next ethical theory in application to civics is social contract theory. So I'll talk a little bit about it. So social contract theory goes something like this. A social contract is an act by which individuals agree to form a governance or even a formal government. And according to the theory, social contract theory, governments are established by people who combine in order to achieve some sort of goal. And theorists hypothesized the existence of something that was called a state of nature. And so a state of nature was this idea that there's, without a social contract, that there is a void in culture and it's always filled by some form of governance. Whether that form of governance is anarchy or authoritarianism or whatever it is, it's always better to come up with a social contract theory, and that ultimately, whether one wants one or not, it sort of forms on its own. So this was a theory created by a guy named Thomas Hobbes, and Hobbes wrote a book called The Leviathan in 1651 during the Civil War in Britain, and he's created this legal theory based on a social contract. And the idea of the book is one, that there is a state of nature that is full of fear, it's brutish, it's a short period of time, and in that space, humans begin craving order, and they begin craving security, and they're willing to fill that void with something. And what do they want? Well, they want to self-protect, they want to self-preserve, and they ultimately want to avoid pain. And so in order to have this, number 4, humans must voluntarily surrender some of their rights and some of their freedom to the mightiest to receive protection from tribal or unruly, uncivil people outside of their state or outside of their civic. And this idea here was that might was right, and that the rule of a group of people was more powerful than any one person. Okay? So that was the beginning of this theory. It was expanded by a guy named John Locke, who really took that idea and expanded it into sometimes called constitutionalism. And so in his idea, the state of nature was a golden age, but property was not secured. And if you've heard me discuss before some of the property laws based on the nation of Israel and how they influence what we have today, from individual property rights to eminent domain, this is again apropos to this discussion. Number 2, the state of nature is unsecure, according to Hobbes and Locke, because of the absence of established law and the absence of an impartial judge and the absence of a natural power to execute natural laws. So for this reason of having property, there is an essential need for some sort of civic government. And so according to John Locke, the purpose of a government and law is to uphold the natural rights of men and women. And so long as the government, or whatever government is established, fulfills this purpose, the laws that are given it are valid and binding. But when a government ceases to fulfill it, then the laws of the land are really no longer valid, and the government is justified in being overthrown. So his idea was that this is a state of liberty, not one of license. Okay? And so that was a very stronger view of what Hobbes had created. Another guy that comes along this between the two of Hobbes and Locke is a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he begins to create something called utilitarianism. And so we'll talk a little bit about utilitarianism. I don't know why that's hard for me to say today. In another video. But I just want to begin introducing a little bit of the world of civics as it relates to our world, the United States, North America, as well as the greater world, when it comes to where did we get some of these things and why are they important today. Again, I believe in the Bible. I believe in freedom. We're going to interact and connect with anybody that would interact and connect with us. However, we do have some conviction when it comes to property, when it comes to individual rights that we believe each person has been given by God, and we have, I think, a very strong standing in terms of our ethics, in terms of our belief in what the Bible has to say on the subject. And so, if you're a part of who we are and joining us, just know that as part of our church, we have people from a variety of political convictions and spectrums, from very liberal to conservative to those who would consider themselves to be socialists in some form or fashion. And we certainly welcome you. You're certainly part of who we are as a group. However, we do not pull any punches when it comes to creating and validating some of these ethical positions that we believe are essential for law and for liberty, and that actually protect all of us in having our voices heard, regardless of who we believe God is or who we don't believe God is. But we want all people to lift up holy hands, of course, and acknowledge God. But we also recognize that we as Christians are called to protect the peace and protect freedom. And so these are why we have these dialogues and why we have these discussions, and allow people to come and form their own opinion based on the best ideas. Thanks for joining me in this video today.